don't really have to go out today. So let's talk about the agenda here for today and tomorrow and really a little bit next week too, just so that we're all kind of on the same page, because spent a little bit of time in the car thinking about how we should kind of arrange the last couple of days. So today this morning we're going to talk about income inequality, right? And the impact of income inequality and growth, and is there a relationship between the two? Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about this morning. This afternoon, we're going to have our peer review workshops, okay? I would like to begin at 1 o'clock. So we're not going to begin at 12:30. Let's begin at 1 o'clock, okay? So just a little bit of delay. I have a meeting that lasts until 12:30, and this meeting always runs long, and so let's just push back class this afternoon to 1 o'clock. It's really not going to be class. Everyone get in Zoom, and then I will pair you up with your partner. And basically, you guys can talk about your papers. And I'm not going to really kind of intervene in this process. You guys can talk through things yourselves. You can spend a little bit of time on each paper. You know, I would like to see you spend at least 20 minutes talking about each paper, but I realize that sometimes you might have more or less to talk about. And so I'm not going to monitor that, but you just kind of get you together here on Zoom to talk about that this afternoon. Okay, so if you have not sent me and your peer review partner a copy of their paper with your comments, do that by noon today. All right, do that by noon. And once again, we will meet at 1 o'clock and do our peer review, okay? Tomorrow, we are going to talk about the pandemic, right? And we will talk about the role of pandemics in economic history, right? And the role of pandemics in growth. And so I think I'm going to send you a short article talking about the Spanish flu. And so you can look at that, and we'll kind of talk through this all tomorrow morning. We won't have afternoon class tomorrow afternoon, okay? So that's the good news, is we'll just have class tomorrow morning, and we'll talk about the pandemic. Then that takes us to next week, right? What's the agenda for next week? So because we have a relatively small class, if you look at the syllabus, it actually says that Monday and Tuesday we would have short presentations. I would like to do all those presentations on Monday, and I think we can do that given we have a relatively small class. If we do 4 of you in the morning and 4 of you in the afternoon, I think that makes the most sense so that everybody goes on Monday, okay? So let me just say a couple of words about the presentation, and we can talk more about this tomorrow. But your presentations are short, and I'm not expecting some sort of fancy PowerPoint or a lot of visuals. I mean, of course, if you want to put together a little PowerPoint, if you want to put together some visuals of some really important results or an important graph, by all means, that would be great. But, I'm not necessarily looking for anything particularly fancy. I would just like each of us to have a little bit of practice talking about the papers that we reviewed and what we learned and how it connects to the big things with the themes of the class. And so, I would like you to put together a presentation that is no more than 15 minutes. Okay, no more than 15 minutes. If it's a little shorter than that, that's okay, but really try not to be any longer than 15 minutes. And also be prepared for some questions, right? And so we'll take 15 minutes for each of you, and maybe we'll add about 5 minutes for questions, and we'll do 4 of you in the morning and 4 of you in the afternoon, and I'll just kind of pick your name out of the hat. We'll just pick a random order, okay? And so you should be prepared to kind of share your screen, and if you want to type up some notes and kind of talk off of those, or you want to, visuals, however it works for you to kind of talk about your paper, that's what we're going to do on Monday. So this weekend, not only do you have to prepare for your final draft, which is due on Tuesday, but you also have to spend a little bit of time putting together this presentation, okay? And so that's part of the reason we're not going to have class Friday afternoon, is so that you have some extra time to work on your presentation, to work on your paper. And of course, Friday afternoon, and this afternoon for that matter, I'll be around if you want to touch base and connect with me and ask me questions. Okay. Does anybody have any quick questions about the presentations next Monday? If not, then that leads us to Tuesday. Tuesday at noon is when your paper is going to be due. Okay. So we will not have class Tuesday morning. You can have Tuesday morning to work on your paper. All right. Your paper will be due at noon, and then at 12:30 on Tuesday, we will have a short class, and it will really just be kind of a little review session. We'll talk a little bit about the final. The final is comprehensive. It will focus on some of the things that we've talked about since the last exam, but it will also be comprehensive in the sense that I'm going to try to kind of ask some big picture questions about the entire block, all right? But as I said, the focus is going to be on big picture questions, and then maybe some smaller detailed questions about some of the things that we've talked about since your midterm. The final exam will be shorter than the midterm, right? It will be shorter. It's only going to be 75 points instead of 125 points. And as I said, I'm probably going to ask some more open-ended questions and not so many detail-orientated questions as I did on the midterm. So so we'll have a short class Tuesday afternoon to review. Then you'll have Tuesday evening to prepare for the exam. We'll take the final on Wednesday. That's it. We did it. All right. So anyway, so it's a busy last week here, right? It's a busy last week. But the good news is we really only have really 2 more days of listening to me today and tomorrow. And really after tomorrow's lecture, that will be we'll kind of be done with the lecture part, and then we'll be moving on to your presentations and, just kind of talking about the final and getting ready for the final. So, so we're doing it. We're going to get through this class one way or another. So anybody have any questions about all of that? Right. That's a lot. And so, by all means, it would be a good idea if tonight you spent a little bit of time thinking about your presentation on Monday, if only because you can ask me some questions on Friday. I mean, I'll be available over the weekend too. Of course, you can ask me questions there, but I have a little bit more time Friday to answer questions. So if you want to make sure that you talk to me, it'd be good to kind of think through your paper a little bit, think through your presentation a little bit this afternoon, so you can ask some good questions. Okay. All right. Well, with that said, let's get into what we're going to talk about today, which is we're going to talk about income inequality. This is a topic that we've talked about some, particularly when we've talked about convergence. And so convergence is talking about incomes, whether or not incomes are getting closer together. And we've many times talked about the fact that convergence is both happening and not happening in the world. But today I want to spend more time talking about income inequality. And economic growth. And really, I think there's three things that we want to talk about today. One is I just want to talk a little bit about the facts and the data. What exactly is happening to income inequality? And what we're going to see is by almost every measure within countries, income inequality is going up across the world, right? So we're seeing more unequal incomes within countries, okay, within countries. Second, we want to talk about why. Why income inequality is rising. Is growth equivalent to rising income inequality? And we'll see that the answer to this is not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, yes, but not necessarily. But we want to talk exactly why income inequality is rising. And a lot of this is, there's some really, I think, very interesting economics related to why income inequality is going on. And really helps us understand our modern economy and understand growth today, to think about why we're having much more unequal incomes than we did in the past. And then finally, we want to think about how does rising inequality impact economic growth. So in other words, it's possible that growth increases inequality, but is it also possible the simultaneity problem, that rising inequality has an impact on growth? And I think there the answer is yes. And to me, the bulk of the evidence suggests that rising inequality is a big reason to be worried about future growth in the US, because it has some really substantial implications for our future economic progress. Okay, so those are going to be kind of the three big questions that we address here today. So let's begin with the first question. Okay, the four big facts about inequality. First off, income inequality within countries. And that's going to be the main kind of income inequality I'm going to be talking about today. So in other words, not income inequality between countries, but income inequality within countries, within the United States, within England, within China, within India. Okay, the first big fact is that income inequality within countries is rising in most countries. The US in particular, since about 1980. So 1980 is an important cutoff when we talk about inequality. Why? Because we've really just seen much different implications. We've seen much different behavior. So let me pull up some data to show you. Wow, what in the world? Sorry, I had all of these visuals pulled up here, and now they've disappeared on me. Ah, what a pain. Hold on one moment while I try to find out where they went. Okay, well, we'll try this. These are not good. Boy, this is really surprising to me. I don't know what exactly I did with these, but okay. So the pictures I'm showing you here are actually from a book that I wrote last year, because this has actually been a topic that has really kind of piqued my interest about the role of economic inequality and growth. And so if we just look at the US first, what we have here is a Gini coefficient. A Gini coefficient is actually quite a complicated calculation. But basically a Gini coefficient is a number that's between 0 and 1. And you can think about interpreting a Gini coefficient this way. 0 would mean absolute equality, right? So a Gini coefficient of 0 means that everybody in the country had the same income. And then a Gini coefficient of 1 means that one person had everything and everybody else had nothing. So 0 means complete equality, 1 means complete inequality. And so this is a measure of equality, right, or inequality. And one of the things that we see here in the US, and if you look in other countries, you see similar patterns, but not as exaggerated as the US, that income inequality in the US has been rising since about mid-1970s, 1980, roughly. Now, you'll notice here there's really an unusual pattern here, that income inequality was very high in the early 1900s. Then it dropped significantly in the 1930s to about 1970, right? So really, the World War II and post-war era was a period of growing equality between people in the United States. But since 1980, we've had growing inequality, right? Growing inequality. And so this has fundamentally changed a lot of things in the US. As I said, if you looked at other countries, I'm going to mainly focus on the US, but if you looked in Europe, you actually see a similar pattern, but not nearly as pronounced. Here's another way of looking at what's going on in the US. If I can pull it up. Okay. So this is kind of a surprising graph or amazing graph. If you haven't seen this before. So this is looking at income gains for different percentiles. So one way we think about income inequality is looking at, like, what does the bottom 10% make? What does the 10 to 20% make? What does the 20 to 30% make? So along the horizontal axis here, this is the percentile that you fall into, right? So for instance, in the US, if you make more than about $95,000 a year, you are in the 90th and above percentile, right? So the 90th percentile is roughly about $95,000. Just to give you some idea, the top 1% is making about $250,000 and more, right? So that gives you some idea where these percentiles. Now, look at how this line looked in 1980. It's the yellow line. In 1980, what was true? That the vertical axis here is the income growth over the previous 34 years. So in 1980, for the previous 34 years, notice that it was that the people at the bottom of the distribution that had the largest gains. And it was the people at the top of the distribution that had lower gains, right? This line in 1980 was downward sloping, meaning the poor were growing faster than the rich were growing faster. What's happened now? Now, this has completely changed around, right? The vast majority of the income gains of the last 34 years have gone to the top 10%. And of those going to the top 10%, who's got the most? The top 1%. And of the top 1%, who has done the best? The top 0.1%. And of the top 0.1%, who's done the best? The top 0.01%, right? So in other words, as you move along this income percentile out closer to 100%, you're seeing larger and larger percentile gains, income gains. And so, you know, the implication of this is that we get this. This is looking at the gross shares of income of the top 1% and the bottom 50% in the US. And so look what's happened. The income share of the top 1% is skyrocketing. while the income share of the bottom 50% is dropping. And now the top 1% makes more than 20% of all income, where the bottom 50% only makes about 13% of all income. So the top 1% are earning increasingly close to twice the amount as the bottom 50%. Okay? That is just a lot of income inequality, right? I mean, it's sometimes when you look at figures like this, it's hard to wrap your mind around, right? How much income inequality is. And, once again, of that top 1%, who's doing the best? The top 0.1%, right? So in other words, who's getting most of that 20%? Well, it's not even the top 1%. It's the people in the top 0.1%. Top 0.1% means people making more than $1 million a year, right? And so as you go up to higher and higher percentiles, they're getting more and more of the income, all right? So no matter how you split it, right? And honestly, I could keep on going on. There's so much data here. And one of the good things about this topic is that economists have brought so much more data to thinking about income inequality across countries than we've ever had before. And so, I could give you more data in 50 ways, but, really that's going to be the story, that income inequality is growing, and it's growing quite dramatically. If you think income inequality is bad, wealth inequality is even worse. Wealth inequality is growing even faster than income inequality. Right? We know the difference between income and wealth. Income is your yearly return. Wealth is your accumulated savings. If we look at wealth, we see even more income inequality. Okay? So last year, if you looked at the 62 richest people in the world, the 62 richest people in the world, actually, I'm sorry, the 28 richest people in the world, not 62, 28 richest people in the world, their wealth was more than half of the world's wealth, right? So in other words, if you took the world and you looked at the poorest 3.5 billion people and added up all their wealth, it's equivalent to the richest 28 people. Okay? It's astonishing. It's astonishing that 28 people own more than half of the world. Once again, you could just keep on looking at data like this and it just kind of blows your mind, right? If you look at the Forbes 400, which is the 400 richest Americans, they own more wealth than all African Americans and 1/3 of Latino Americans combined. Right? 400 people own more than all African Americans and 1/3 of Latino Americans. Right now, we have about 2,500 billionaires in the United States. Of those 2,500 billionaires, 227 are women. 10 are Black. 3 are Black women. 1 is Oprah. I don't know who the other 2 are off the top of my head. I know 1's Oprah. But I mean, it's crazy, right? It's crazy that you have 2,500 billionaires and you have 3 Black women, right? I mean, there's, and we could just keep on going on and on. If you look at average global wealth, right? If you took the globe's wealth and you just averaged it among people, it's about $56,000 a person. But what's median wealth? About $3,000. So the fact that median is so different from average just tells you how skewed this distribution is, right? It is big time skewed. And then finally, we've talked about the rich and the poor. But the middle class size is shrinking. So usually we define the middle class in the US as if you took the poverty line, right? And you added 50% to the poverty line. That's the bottom of the middle class. And then if you tripled the poverty line, that's kind of the top of the middle class. Okay. Now honestly, that's a very arbitrary cutoff. And so this definition of the middle class understood is somewhat arbitrary. But by pretty much any measure of how you define the middle class, we see that population in the middle class in most countries is declining. And here we see in the US, right? If you go back to 1980, the middle class was about a third of the US population. Today, it's about 27%, right? So we've lost about 6% of our population out of the middle class. That's a lot. And as we're going to talk about, that's a lot because, it's a lot because middle class plays a big role in functioning society, particularly functioning democracies. Right? Our fourth fact is that you might say, well, okay, income inequality is going up, but maybe that's not such a big deal because as long as people that are at the bottom have an opportunity to move up, then that's okay. You're right. Maybe we have just a lot of inequality because some people are really smart and other people are not so smart, right? Or some people are really productive and other people aren't really productive. And so as long as the productive people are getting paid a lot, maybe that's fine. And I guess there's maybe a certain economic logic to that if it was true. But unfortunately, there's no real reason to believe that the smartest people are also the people who are the richest, right? And part of the reason that we know this is not true is because intergenerational mobility is declining. Intergenerational mobility is declining. What do I mean by that? Intergenerational mobility just refers to how closely correlated a child's income is with a parent's income, right? So this is one of those those areas where, once again, the data that is now available to economists is just amazing, right? That basically what economists have been able to do is get data for 70, 80, 90 years, tax return data, in which big data, right, of millions and millions of people, in which economists can essentially tie what a parent's income is to a kid's income, and then what their income is to their kid's income, and just tie it across generations. And so intergenerational elasticity is really how closely correlated a child's income is with a parent's income. So how big is this in the US? Well, in the US, this is about 0.5. Now that number in and of itself doesn't really mean much. How are we supposed to interpret that? Well, let's put it this way. A child's height, what's the elasticity between a parent's height and a child's height? It's 0.5. So income across generations is about as closely tied as a kid's height is across generations, meaning pretty closely tied. Pretty closely tied. And if you look across countries, what do we see? Sometimes this is called the Horatio Alger curve, right? Horatio Alger wrote these books about like poor people becoming rich, or sometimes called the Gatsby curve, right? Poor people becoming rich. So how often does that actually happen? Well, this is looking at, on the horizontal axis here, intergenerational elasticity, meaning a lower number here means that there's more mobility across generations. And a higher number means that there's less mobility because a parent's income is very tightly tied to a kid's income. And then the vertical axis is the Gini coefficient, how unequal the country is. And you'll see that across countries, we see a pretty high correlation between countries that are more unequal having less intergenerational mobility. So you see here, the US does not, we tend to think about ourselves as a country in which the poor get ahead. We don't do so great, right? The US actually does not have a particularly low level of intergenerational mobility. It's better than places like China, right, and Peru, but it's not good, right? It's not good. The US has a relatively high intergenerational mobility here. So, you know, what this is suggesting is that the inability of kids to move across income deciles, to go from being poor to rich, and also to go from rich to being poor, is related to overall income inequality, right? And we know this, right? We know this, and we're going to come back and talk about this in a minute because this is a worrisome feature. If in a world in which it really is a meritocracy, right? Meaning in a world in which the rich are really the people that are the best, we would expect to see much, much more intergenerational elasticity, or I'm sorry, much, much more intergenerational mobility than we do. Okay, so those are the facts, right? Those are the facts. Income inequality is getting worse, particularly since the 1980s. Wealth inequality is even greater. We don't have a lot of intergenerational mobility. So I guess the question is, why is inequality rising? Why is inequality rising? This is our second big question that we want to talk about. Why is inequality rising? And if it was just one thing that was driving inequality, then that would make it simple. But in reality, there's a lot of factors that are driving this. And many of them are related to topics that we've talked about in this class. And so I want to talk about 7 factors that are driving income inequality, a lot, right? But these are all things that I think there's sound evidence to support these things increasing income inequality, both in the US and across other countries. The first is often referred to by economists as skills-based technological change.
Professor, can you share the screen?
Okay. So,
can you share the screen?
What does skills-based technological change mean? So, oftentimes this is referred to as the race between technology and education. Okay, so we've talked a lot about technology in this class, all right? New technologies create demand for different kinds of human capital. However, how long does it take? Oh, sorry, thank you. I have to share my screen. Is this popping up? There we go. Okay, skills-based technological change, otherwise known as the race between technology and education. Okay, so we have technological change, but what do we know? These technologies often demand a new set of human capital. So what has to happen? Technology changes, and then education has to catch up. The education level of the population has to catch up. What happens in the meantime? In the meantime, wages for those people who have the human capital needed because of the new technology will go up. So in other words, think about a new technology that raises the demand for those who have a college education. A new technology that raises the demand for those that have college education. What's going to happen to their wages? Those wages are going to go up, at least until more people can get a college education and enter the labor force and drive wages back down. So this is the idea between skills-based technological change. Technology is racing ahead, and slowly but surely, our education is trying to catch up. What happens when educational attainment lags behind technology? It's going to drive up wages for certain jobs. And that's going to create some inequality, right? That's going to create some inequality. Okay, so here's a figure from my book looking at changes in wages for full-time male workers. Okay, so we're just looking at male workers here. And what do you see? The wages for graduate school workers, meaning workers that have completed a graduate education, have gone up the most. Then you see increases in college graduate. And then after that, everybody else's wages are pretty flat, right? So in other words, wages have been driven up for particularly graduate wages, but also undergraduate wages. Everybody else's wages are flat. And this is consistent with this story that technology has increased the returns to human capital, because most of our technologies nowadays require a lot of human capital to really take advantage of, right? So it's different than in the old days. In the old days, we had technologies like, the internal combustion engine that actually provided a lot of benefit to all kinds of workers. But today, we have technologies that involve, for instance, biochemical engineering, right? Well, maybe those have benefits for everybody, but largely it's a small number of people who reap most of the benefits. And those small number of people are people who have, high levels of graduation, very, very specialized skills. So anybody some of you might have actually heard this terminology shown up in some of your papers. Anybody who talks about technology, right, or any paper that talks about technology, inevitably gets around to this idea of skills-based technological change, right? How technology is changing the nature of the skills needed in the labor force, and how there is this kind of race between technology. And so, how we could say here is that education is losing. Education is losing the race, and as a result, wages for educated are rising faster than supply of these workers is rising. So that is almost certainly one of the things that's driving inequality, right? Almost certainly, this is one of the things that's driving inequality. And what do you do about it? Well, we'll come back and talk to this, but there's no simple solutions. I mean, one solution is, well, we'd like to create more educated workers. But of course, that's a hard thing to do. You just don't build new colleges and get people who are prepared to do well in college to get there, right? I mean, this is a generational thing that takes years and years of investment. And so, you know, this is a hard thing to do. Related to this, number two is actually kind of related to number one. The increasing importance of intangible capital. What is intangible capital? Intangible capital means capital that you can't touch. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about ideas, networks, organizations, platforms, supply chains, training procedures, and intellectual property. These are forms of capital that are intangible, meaning you can't touch them. And they are increasingly an important part of the toolkit for many workers. Okay. There's one economist, they said that when you think about the modern world, we're living in a weightless world. And a weightless world really means that more and more what we produce and what we consume is not tangible things, but it's intangible things, right? It's ideas, it's networks, it's Zoom meetings, it's Netflix, right? You know, it's music, it's, you know, all these things, research, right? Databases, software, creative materials, design, branding, okay? All of this stuff that doesn't necessarily have a very big physical component. A lot of it is intangible. And of course, what's the true about all these intangible things? Well, the key word here is this first one, ideas. They're all based on ideas. And of course, what do we know? Ideas require human capital. So if you are a software engineer, your world has been greatly changed by the move to intangible capital. And it has greatly increased your productivity. But if you are a lumberjack, it hasn't changed crap about your job. Nothing has changed for you. You still live in the old-fashioned material world, where many of us are living in the kind of weightless world. And so, you know, once again, this is creating inequality, right? It's creating inequality because what this means is some people are seeing, you know, these huge increases in their productivity because they have access to all of this intangible capital, while other people who need physical capital aren't able to increase it as much. One other thing to note about this is that this is the kind of capital that's hard to tax. So one of the things that, you know, if you pay attention to the technology industry, companies like Apple actually pay extremely little tax. And part of the way they do it is because so much of their revenue is associated with intellectual property. And so intellectual property can exist anywhere. So what does Apple do? They'll just transfer all the profits they make from intellectual property to the Bahamas, where there's no tax on it, and then they don't pay tax, right? This kind of capital is harder to tax than physical capital. And this will relate to one of the things we talk about later, that one of the things that's driving inequality is our inability to tax the rich, right? Which is certainly contributing some to this. Number 3 is related to number 1 and 2. Globalization. And we all know about comparative advantage. We know that the US has comparative advantage in human capital intensive goods. We tend to specialize them. This increases wages and employment in these sectors. So globalization has helped, certainly has helped one aspect of the economy, which is people who work in human capital intensive industries. What about low skilled workers? They now face global competition. Right? The low skilled worker now faces a lot more global competition than they have in the past. And this has tended to keep their wages low. Has globalization been on net beneficial to the US? I don't think there's any doubt, yes. And from a macroeconomic perspective, we know that more trade leads to more ideas and more growth, right? It is good for the US as a whole, but has it created some losers? Yes. And has it created some winners? Yes. And those winners have tended to be people who are already well off. And the losers have tended to be people who are at the bottom of the income distribution. And so globalization almost certainly has contributed. And one of the problems that I think many economists have identified is we've enacted few government policies to compensate the losers. Right? So one way that you could correct for this is you could have policies that could compensate the losers. For instance, job retraining. Or more extensive unemployment benefits. But the US hasn't done this. We have not tried to help out the losers in any significant way, right? And I think many economists feel very frustrated about that. Okay, one more reason before we take a break. Reason number 4 is tied to reason number 3. Right, so all of these are kind of related to each other. But one aspect of globalization is it tends to help the human capital intensive. And we know technology tends to help the human capital intensive. But amongst the people that have a lot of human capital, who does it help the most? It tends to help the superstars. The top 0.01%, that very, very top of the income distribution, are the superstars. And they have gotten a huge share of the gains. And why? Why are superstars so much more valuable now? Well, it's just a reflection of economic reality. Globalization plus information technology have increased the value of people with unique skills. sometimes these are called winner-take-all markets. Winner-take-all markets. All right, so think about, it's a good example. Think about the Olympics, right? Think about the Olympics. What's the value of a gold medal in, for instance, figure skating? Millions of dollars, right? Millions of dollars. Being the one person that gets a gold medal can be worth a lot of money in marketing and other opportunities. What's the value of a silver medal? I mean, you can be that much less good than a gold medal, and the value of silver is almost nothing. Or think about the 100-yard dash, right? How much slower is the second guy? Not much slower, and yet all anybody remembers is who wins the gold medal, right? And so this happens in a lot of industries. In the movie industry, right? Tom Cruise gets paid $35 million a movie now. Is he worth it? Well, I mean, from an artistic standpoint, maybe not. But from an economic standpoint, what happens if you get Tom Cruise in your movie? Then the movie is going to sell in China. It's going to sell in Europe. It's going to sell in South America because everybody knows Tom Cruise. The movie is going to be sold at McDonald's as part of Happy Meals. You're going to have action figures. You're going to have streaming rights. You're going to have all of this stuff that comes along with having Tom Cruise in your movie, right? And so, yeah, you know, he's probably worth $35 million, even though by any standard, most actors in Hollywood are not that much different an actor, right? At least in terms of their skill. In fact, probably there's many actors that are in Hollywood that are better actors than Tom Cruise. But, you know, once you get perceived as being the best, this matters. And so this happens in entertainment. It certainly happens in sports, right? You see these big value contracts to, you know, a small number of people, in law, in finance, right? And in fact, if you look at who is in this top 0.01%, most of the people that are in this top 0.01% are in these industries: entertainment, sports, law, and finance, right? They are a huge portion of this top 1.01% because these are industries that are very, very susceptible to the economics of superstars. Okay, I want to take a little break here. There's a couple of other reasons why inequality has been rising that I think are worth us talking about. And then we'll talk about, well, how does this impact growth, right? Does this rising inequality have some impacts on growth? But how about let's meet back here at 10:05, okay? All right, enjoy your break. All right, everybody. So back on our quest here to figure out all the things, or to talk about all the things that are causing inequality in the US and other countries. And so we talked about these economics of superstars. When you think about superstars, you got to think about the elites, right? And so point number 4 is connected to point number 5. There's a vicious circle between inequality and the power of elites. The rich those who are getting richer are seeing their power go up. And how are they using their power? To get richer, right? In a never-ending cycle. They do this through things like political influence. By things such as money in politics. Okay, the top 0.01%, those superstars in the United States contributed half of campaign funding last year, right? The superstars contribute half of the money for our campaigns. It leads to dysfunctional politics. In which, you know, there's a lot. One of the things we know that there is a lot of in the United States right now is polarization and extremes. I don't even have to justify these things, right? You guys read the news, you know what's going on, right? Our politics have gotten more extreme. And part of this is because our economics and our incomes have gotten more extreme. And inequality has actually made our policy on redistribution. So in other words, as we've gotten more unequal, our policy actually worries less and less about equality, right? And so just to pick one example of this, look what's happened to tax rates in the US. Oops, isn't this working? Oh, let me stop sharing the screen. Something is screwed up here. Okay, here's average tax rates in the US. Average tax rates. So basically looking at how much you pay in taxes divided by your total income. And notice if we go back to the 1930s and 40s, let me shrink the size of this so it fits on the screen. Doesn't work so well. But if we go back to the 1930s and 40s, we see that there was quite a big difference between the tax that the top 1% paid and the bottom 50%, right? So in other words, taxes in the US were quite progressive. The richer you are, the more that you paid in income. Today, a lot of that progressivity has disappeared. And in fact, you know, many billionaires will report that they actually pay lower tax rates than people like their secretaries, right? Warren Buffett said this, that he actually looked at his secretary's return and found that she was paying a lower tax rate than he was, which is kind of amazing, but you know, that's the system that we have. Either because tax rates have fallen or because there's so many more ways to kind of hide or shelter your money. And so, you know, this is in many ways a reflection of our politics, where it's becoming harder and harder to sell policies that focus on redistribution, right? So we all know about, you know, the estate tax in the US, which is really only paid by about one out of every 700 people who die have to pay the estate tax, right? So this is only the richest of the rich, right? The top 0.1% is paying an estate tax. And yet, right, one party has kind of recast this as not the estate tax, but the death tax, and largely restricted who's subject to it. You know, those kind of things have contributed to wealth being passed on from generation to generation, and of course, driving inequality. Okay. Now, sixth thing, getting close to the end of our exhaustive list. The sixth thing I'm just going to blame on you guys. You guys are the problem for inequality. Why? Because of who you date and who you marry, right? This idea is called assortative mating. Increasingly, inequality is voluntary. The rich marry the rich, and the poor marry the poor. Now, you might say, well, isn't that the way it's always been? No, this is actually not the way that it's always been, at least not in the United States, right? Before 1970, there actually was very close to zero correlation between a man's income and a woman's income when they got married. In fact, what we tended to see is that richer men tended to marry poorer women, in part because, we had much different home lives, right, in the 1950s and before, right, where many women did not work. And so, the women's income was probably less of a decision in getting a marriage, right? But today, we see that there is a very high correlation between the income of a man and the income of the woman that marry. Or now that we have marriage is much more broadly defined, when two men marry, their incomes are very highly related. Likewise, with two women, when they marry, their incomes are very closely related, right? And so this is actually explaining a lot of income inequality, because we tend to think about household income when we talk about inequality. It's not really individual income as much as it is household income. And so what do we see? We see some households have two high incomes and some households have two low incomes. That's going to create a lot of inequality. This also has profound impacts. Profound impacts on how children are raised. And here there's just a wealth of studies that have talked about how households with two college-educated parents raise their children much differently than in households that do not have college-educated parents, right? For instance, a woman without a college education is 5 times as likely to be an unmarried or unpartnered mother. Right, I'll say that again. Someone without a woman without a college education is 5 times more likely to be a single parent. Children from high income, high educated parents, they talk to their parents on average 3 hours more a week than low income, low educated parents, right? So just simply the number of words that kids are hearing from their parents and not from screens or not from the television is really quite dramatic. And it differs largely because of the income levels of parents, right? And so, this is a real issue, right? How do we get more kids that do not have educated parents the kind of education they need to succeed? Well, that's very hard because a lot of education takes place at home. It takes place informally. And so one of the things we observe is that parents that have lower income, less education, don't spend as much time on that informal education. And so this is undoubtedly one of the things that's reducing intergenerational mobility, right? How do you solve this problem? Well, I don't know. I mean, that's the hard thing. Should we make rich people marry poor people? I mean, these are not easy solutions, right? There's something very important socially going on here that has a lot of economic consequences, but I'm not really sure what the economic solution to it is, other than maybe helping the parents of, other than helping less college educated parents get the resources they need to act more like college educated parents, right? But that's hard to do. That's hard to do. Okay, the last thing we want to talk about. And this is the one that is also closely related to many of the things that we've talked about in class. And you probably have heard a little bit about this theory if you've heard about Thomas Piketty. And Thomas Piketty is an unusual thing in economics. He's kind of a celebrity. And so Piketty wrote this book a couple years ago called Capital, which was, I think, probably one of the biggest best-selling books of the 21st century, right? I still think it's up there, like in the top 5 most sold books over in this century. So, I mean, it is a remarkable splash, particularly for a book that is pretty dense. I mean, it's pretty dense with data, and it's not a page turner by most senses of the word, but it's a pretty interesting book. And so what Piketty is interested in explaining is he's interested in explaining the growing wealth inequality. And so Piketty says, listen, you can explain growing wealth inequality by the following equation. If R is greater than G, you're going to have growing inequality. And if R is less than G, you're going to have shrinking inequality. Now, what are R and G? G is RG from class. It's the per capita income, per capita GDP growth rate, right, or income growth rate. And what's R? R is the return on your capital. So for instance, you could think of R as kind of like a real interest rate. The real return on capital. So if you think about this, intuitively, this makes sense. What is G? G is the rate at which everyone's income is growing. What is R? R is the rate at which a big segment of the rich income is growing. Okay? So if we go up here to this, when R is greater than G, then the rich's return on capital is faster than overall growth. Meaning their wealth is growing faster. That their wealth is growing faster than overall wealth is growing. And so he calls this patrimonial capital. What does patrimonial mean? Patrimonial basically means father to children, right? And so you kind of have to think about what happens to capital over generations. It just gets passed down and it continues to accumulate. This is just a recognition that capital compounds. Capital and wealth compound over time. And if it's compounding at a greater rate than overall growth, what's going to happen to wealth disparity? It's going to go up by a lot. And so, this was Piketty's argument that what we're going to see is we're going to see increasing wealth inequality as long as the returns to wealth are greater than overall growth. And so what Piketty argues in the data seem to suggest that R is greater than G for long periods of time. In other words, that this is probably playing a role, the role of patrimonial capital. Okay. So, and why is this? Why do the wealthy get higher returns than overall growth? Well, in the US, this happens in a number of ways. One way that it happens is in our real estate market, right? Where do most rich people live? They live in big cities. What's true about real estate markets in most big cities in the US? They're going up at much faster than the rate of overall income, right? So between 1975 and 2016, the value of real estate in Washington, D.C. went up by a factor of 78. It went 78 times in those 30 years. What happened to housing prices in Alaska? No change, right? So if you were lucky enough to have wealth invested in the DC real estate market, you made a killing. And if you didn't, right? And so, this is just one of a number of ways in which the rich tend to get richer, right? We know that there's been a lot of other research that suggests that the rich get a higher return on their wealth than other people do because they're able to identify more profitable opportunities because they have connections or they know people, right? Now, listen, there's a lot to be said about this, and there's a lot of debate among economics about how important this is. One thing I want to say is that this is only partially responsible. I don't think that this is an explanation for everything. It is true that the rich have greater wealth, but I want to say something else. The wealthy also have higher incomes. Often because they have more human capital. So the wealthy aren't getting ahead only because of the stock market. They're also getting ahead because, interestingly enough, the wealthy also tend to have a lot of human capital. They tend to be the people who go to the Ivy Leagues, right? Not to disparage any of you here at Cornell College, but they tend to be the kids that have those like premier opportunities, right? And it opens up this wealth of connections for them. So, I think patrimonial capital is an interesting idea, but I don't want to give it too much. I don't want to say that this is the only thing that matters. In fact, all of these things, we've talked about 7 things, right? It's taken us a long time to work through these. But I think in their own way, all of these are very important in explaining why there's so much inequality. The question for us here in our last couple of minutes is, why does inequality matter for growth? One, as we have talked about many times in this class, our productivity is not individual, it's networked. We know of the importance of leaks and matches. We are as important, or we are as productive as the people who are around us. So what happens when certain people are being left behind? It hurts all of us. It really hurts all of us, right? So when we have a segment of the population that essentially cannot escape poverty, that's not just hurting them. It is hurting us, because what it means is that there's a lot of people that have skills that simply cannot take advantage of them. This is a really interesting piece of research. We don't really have time to talk about it in great detail, but let me just kind of talk about it very briefly. So this is looking at that, remember, intergenerational elasticity, okay? So how closely correlated a kid's income is with a parent's income. And this is looking across different areas of the United States, right? Different areas of the United States. The darker areas mean higher elasticity, meaning less mobility. And lighter areas mean more mobility. And you can see how much difference there is in different parts of the US, right? On the West Coast particularly is a great place for intergenerational mobility. In fact, this is kind of surprising, but you know, one of the best places in the United States in terms of intergenerational mobility is Iowa, right? Iowa has actually relatively good numbers in terms of intergenerational mobility. But what happens if you go down to the South? You see significantly less intergenerational mobility. So what this means is that many people are just trapped in poverty. And when they're trapped in poverty, we can't take advantage of all the leaks and matches that we could if they could escape from poverty. So that is clearly, I think, a big loss for society when we have a lot of people who just simply can't take advantage of what markets have to offer. Okay, so this might not seem obvious, but fairness and respect matter in economics. For instance, there is a lot of evidence that suggests that what happens when workers work in societies that are more fair, that they perceive as being more fair, they work harder, right? There's a wide range of psychological studies that show that if you think you're superior, or I'm sorry, if you work with people who you think they're superior to you, you feel worse about yourself. And when you feel worse about yourself, you're less productive, right? You work less, you don't show up to work as much, you have a bad attitude, you don't network as much, right? So lots of kind of detailed studies suggest that when you are working in an environment that you don't feel like you're, you know, kind of a respected part of the network, you're much less productive. Likewise, I'm sorry to just kind of be blowing through this, but there is a ton of data that suggests that health is significantly impacted by inequality. independent of income levels, right? So there's a couple of studies that have suggested that if you look at the determinants of health and you control for differences in income, income inequality still matters. That countries with more income inequality have lower life expectancy. They have higher infant mortality. This gets back to what I was talking about briefly yesterday about the decline in life expectancy in the US, right? Many observers have called these deaths of despair. Because when you don't feel like you're a respected part of the community, you're much more likely to engage in having addictive behaviors, depression, all these things that reduce your health. And that, of course, contributes to economic outcomes. And then, as we've talked about yesterday, fairness impacts institutions. That having a sense of trust matters. And inequality reduces trust. So here's a interesting paper that I'll just tell you about briefly. This was a study that showed that air rage, we know what air rage is, right? People freaking out on airplanes. Air rage is twice as likely if the passengers have to walk through first class first, as opposed to entering in the back of the plane where they go right in the coach. So having to walk through first class, right, makes air rage twice as likely, right? And that study is just based on the fact that there are many airplanes in service in which people enter in the back. And so entering in the back makes air rage much less likely. And so just being reminded that life is not fair makes us pissed off, and we lose a sense of trust. Then there's just the outright economic discrimination, right? Fairness matters because there is a lot of evidence that supports that there is outright economic discrimination against some groups. Once again, so many studies that have looked at different aspects of economic integration. For instance, there's been a couple of randomized studies where economists distribute CVs to different opening positions. The only difference in the CVs is that some CVs have white names attached to them, while other CVs have black names attached to them. And what do they find out? The resumes with white names got 50% more callbacks than the resumes with black names, right? There's lots of evidence in the criminal justice system that people who are blacker, and by blacker I mean like pictures, right? They'll pick pictures of different defendants and use computer analysis to judge how dark their skin is. And people who are charged with crimes that have darker skins are 7 to 8 months more likely to be found, or was it 25% more likely to be found guilty, and they get sentences of 7 to 8 months longer, right? You might be aware of this study about orchestra auditions, where when orchestra auditions were conducted where the player sat behind a curtain, women fared much better in orchestra auditions than they did when the judges could see the gender of the person, right? This just goes on and on and on, right? I mean, anybody who says that we don't have any sort of economic discrimination in the U.S. really are not looking at the literature, right? the literature is excessive, right? The literature is excessive about this. And so, you know, to put this another way, institutions, right? Inequality has a lot of danger for our institutions, right? It creates a lot of danger for our institutions. In terms of politics, right? We know that it creates a lot of polarization. And it gets harder to have that shackled Leviathan when people can't work together to find happy mediums. So for those of you who are somewhat familiar with political theory, you're probably familiar with de Tocqueville, who's a French philosopher who came to the United States in the 1700s and talked about, you know, the political system of the U.S. And one of the things that shows up again and again in de Tocqueville's discussion of the U.S. was what he called the general equality of conditions, and how he explained how the general equality of conditions were extremely conducive towards a well-functioning democracy. Because when everyone is roughly in the same place, everybody kind of sees things in a similar manner. And they kind of see the value of balance in the middle. But when you have too much of the population on one side or the other, that middle gets hollowed out, right? And it tends to lead to separatism and tribalism and conflict. And so a lot of our populism, right? I mean, I think in many ways, instead, what you get, instead of getting the shackled Leviathan where you have this happy middle, you have on one extreme populism versus kind of an elite dictatorship, right? And we find this constant argument between people who are completely populist on one side that want majority to rule everything, and then people who, you know, really are vulnerable to thinking about elite power, right? And think about politics as only about power and entrenching the power of the elites, right? Not to get too much out on a side note, but, you know, it's interesting to kind of think about Trump as an interesting fusion of these things, right? I mean, one of the reasons why Trump was probably a successful politician was he was able to draw people from both sides of the extreme. He was able to appeal both to people who kind of have a fascination with elite power, but also with populists who are completely frustrated with the status quo, right? And given that we have a country in which there's a very bimodal distribution, right? We have a lot of people on either extreme. Trump's ability to kind of appeal to people on either extreme made him a very powerful politician in many ways, right? It does not make for good institutions, though, right? And it doesn't make, I think most economists would agree, it doesn't make for the conditions under which a country can sustain economic growth over the long run. So, economic inequality, right? At first glance, you might think, well, that's maybe a consequence of growth, but that doesn't impact growth. But I think that the more and more you think about these issues and you kind of think about what's driving inequality and some of the ramifications of it, I think more and more this is becoming kind of a cornerstone issue when we think about the future of economic growth in the US and other places. And I think economists have come to this realization, right? I think in general, many economists traditionally have said, let's just grow the pie and not worry so much about how we cut up the pieces. But what I've tried to argue here today is you can't think about how you grow the pie unless you also think about how you cut up the pieces, right? Those aren't two separate decisions, right? Those things are related to each other. Because if you do not think about cutting up that pie relatively equally, it's going to be hard to grow the pie in the first place, because not everybody's going to want to participate, and not everybody can participate, right? So there's my sermon for the day, right? Amen. All right. So let's just back up here. This afternoon, we meet at 1 o'clock, right? Everybody clear about that? We're not meeting at 12:30. We're going to meet at 1 o'clock, a little bit later, so that I can finish up this other meeting. We'll meet at 1 o'clock. All we're going to do is do our peer review conferences. So you're just going to meet with your peer and kind of talk over some stuff. By the way, I am reading your papers right now, and I will get them to you by tomorrow. Okay, so I'm also going to provide comments on your first draft, and I'll send them sometime to you tomorrow. Okay, so you can expect that to work on this weekend, as well as your peer review comments. And so you can work towards getting the first draft of your paper together, and also towards making sure that you have a short 10 to 15 minute presentation on Monday. Okay, all right, everyone, have a good lunch. Have some fun snow shoveling. I think that's what I'm going to go do. So we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock.